Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 202. So today, we are going to talk about Durkheim, and specifically, we're going to talk about his book, The Division of Labor in Society. Except that I didn't have you read the whole book, it was only some short selections, so hopefully this lecture will help you put it all together. So, let's get started. So let's begin, as we always do, by talking about the author. So here is Émile Durkheim. He was a pretty famous French sociologist because he was one of the first people to bring sociology to France. Basically, over the course of his education, he decided that he wanted to study the social sciences, but they didn't quite exist at the time, so he had to go to Germany where they were starting to invent them and then bring them back to his own home. So over the course of his career, Durkheim was primarily concerned with what he called modernity, which is what we've been talking about all semester. This idea that everything changed after the Industrial Revolution, and things were different now. So much like Weber, he was trying to explain what he saw. And over the course of his career, he developed a lot of ways to think about it. So basically, his education was not exactly standard, but pretty standard. He came from a long line of rabbis, so he started at rabbinical school. But then he decided he didn't want to be a rabbi after all, so he ended up getting a degree in philosophy. But he thought that philosophy was too sort of out there. He didn't like the lack of facts or the lack of science. So he decided to go to Germany, to Leipzig, and get a degree in sociology, which had basically just been invented. Then he came back to France, brought sociology with him, and spent the rest of his academic career sort of promoting the science of sociology, like writing academic journals about sociology and trying to promote it as a science. Durkheim's personal life is not really as exciting as a lot of our other authors. He was married and he had 2 children. He rose to prominence in academia over the course of his life. He was really well respected during his own lifetime, although he was a known leftist, so he did get in trouble with the government occasionally. But basically, World War I was a big problem for him. It sort of made his whole world crumble. His son died while serving, and Durkheim never really recovered, so he died almost immediately following that war. So he's one of the people who, again, was watching social change happen in his world around him and decided to write about it and try to apply some science. So these are Durkheim's most famous books, and we are, of course, reading The Division of Labor in Society, which was actually his doctoral dissertation turned into a book. But he also wrote a few key pieces that people still read today, especially in sociology. So the first one, of course, Rules for Sociological Method, which we'll talk about in a second. He also wrote On Suicide, which is much less depressing than it sounds. It's basically a study using statistical data to try to explain something that was psychological. And then, of course, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, which had a huge impact because he was basically examining the ways that religion helps with social control. So the one that we're reading is very important. It's very much about the changes that he saw happening in the world and how he thought that might have happened. But one of his main goals was to try to apply methodology to something that had previously not really had methodology. So he was kind of annoyed by philosophy because he didn't like the idea that people were basically just sitting there being like, these are some ideas that I have. So he wanted to start using the scientific method to study humans. And again, this was just in its infancy. People were starting to do psychology and people were starting to do sociology, but the idea of studying facts and people at the same time was still kind of new. So basically, he thought, when he wrote his Sociological Method study book, that social studies must focus on facts. So no more feelings, no more speculation, no more just these are some thoughts that I have, facts. It also had to use the scientific method. So in sociology, again, it's very important that everything is scientifically laid out, that everything is quantified, that everything is measured. We're very concerned with basically isolating variables and seeing how they affect things. So this is the way that Durkheim himself phrased it. Only by comparing does one explain. Thus, a scientific investigation cannot achieve its ends unless it is concerned with facts that can be compared. And the more it is assured of having collected all those facts that can be usefully compared, the more likely it is to succeed. So again, as part of the larger movement towards things being more quantitative and more scientific, he was making social sciences more quantitative and more scientific. And that was one of his primary focuses throughout his life. So now we begin with his book, The Division of Labor in Society. And we are, of course, not reading the whole book. We are reading the best parts and pieces from the book. But the thing that you need to know about the book as a whole is that it's trying to ask this question. When we start dividing up labor and moving to the city, do people get more happy or less happy? Again, he was watching these massive social changes around him, and he was trying to figure out if they were ultimately positive or not positive. So we're reading from the part that is called The Division of Labor and Social Differentiation, subtitle, The Growth of Structural Differentiation and Social Development. So it kind of sounds like word salad, but trust me, once we get into it, you'll understand what he's trying to examine. So Durkheim starts with his question of social solidarity. Basically, he's worried that as people move to the city and as they get different types of jobs, the social world becomes less solid and a little bit more divided. So he describes the transition by breaking society up into two categories. Basically, he says that there is mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. And mechanical solidarity is the old school one. It's more traditional. Everybody's more homogenous. Basically, everybody has the same traditions and beliefs. Whereas organic solidarity is more modern. Everyone is a little bit more specialized, but still interdependent and a little bit more different. I have always gotten these backwards every single time because it seems misnamed to me, but whatever, I'm not Durkheim. So this is how he describes the old school version, mechanical solidarity. For segmental organization to be possible, the segments must resemble one another. Without that, they would not be united. So this is when everybody in your tribe or clan or town basically believes all the same stuff. You're all really similar, so it's really easy to get along. Organic solidarity, on the other hand, is more complicated. These are formed not by the repetition of similar, homogeneous segments, but by a system of different organs, each of which has a special role and which are themselves formed of differentiated parts. So we're not all the same anymore. We're all different. We're all doing different things, but we are still dependent on one another. So basically, we went from all being samesies to all being different, but we are still connected. It's just a different kind of connection. Durkheim's primary concern with separating society into different groups is that, as soon as we separate things, we also organize them into a hierarchy. So instead of being even, now everybody is sort of up and down on a ladder. So this is how he describes it. Not only are social elements not of the same nature, but they are not distributed in the same way. They are not juxtaposed in a linear fashion, but coordinated and subordinated one under the other. So again, as soon as we start to separate things, we also start to rank things. He goes on to say that this has changed how we think about each other. In this type, individuals are no longer grouped according to their relations of lineage, like their families, but according to the particular nature of the social activity to which they devote themselves, their jobs. Their natural and necessary milieu is no longer that given by birth, but that given by occupation. So instead of people saying like, oh, who are your family? Like, who is your daddy and what does he do? They say, what do you do? Like, you exist as an individual separate from your whole family. And again, that was different. He's a little bit worried about how people are handling this transition. So he says the substance of social life must enter in an entirely new combinations in order to organize itself upon completely different foundations. But the old structure, so far as it persists, is opposed to this. This is why it must disappear. So again, he's saying people don't necessarily like this change. People are used to knowing each other based on their families or their tribes or their traditions. And now we have to switch and know each other based on our jobs and our individual sort of natures. And he's saying this is a little uncomfortable, but the old way has to go. So what Durkheim does next is to go into more detail. So this section is basically about the decline of mechanical solidarity and the emergence of moral individualism. So again, the decline of all-togetherness and the rise of individual. So the first thing that he starts to talk about is what has previously held us all together. Not only in a general way does mechanical solidarity link men less strongly than organic solidarity, but also as we advance in the scale of social evolution, it becomes increasingly weak. So he's saying that the bonds that hold society together are becoming increasingly weak. The thing that is interesting about this is that he says we used to all have the same ideas about most stuff, because we used to sort of share a consciousness. And he calls this the conscience collective, which is kind of an unfortunate translation of the French. It might be easier to think of it as collective unconscious, which you might have heard of in psychology, or to think of it as doxa, which we sometimes say, or to think of it as just like stuff everybody knows. There used to just be stuff everybody knows. Everybody knows that when you say football in America, you don't mean soccer. Or everybody knows that when you go into someone's house in Japan, you take your shoes off. But we don't always know what the other people have. We don't always know what the other societies believe. So the conscience collective can be pretty specific, because it might be just what your society believes. And what Durkheim is worried about is that as we change and grow and move out into the world, we're sort of loosening those bonds because we don't all think the same stuff anymore. So he's talking about how we are changing. We don't all have the same religion anymore. We don't all have the same politics or traditions. We don't all have the same norms. And on the one hand, this is confusing. On the other hand, this is progress. So basically what he's spending this piece exploring is whether or not this sort of loosening of our collective bonds is bad. Because that was a major question at the time. So one of the things that Durkheim sees changing is how connected we are to the conscience collective. Basically, everybody used to be really tied in to all of the norms and all of the practices that were traditional in your society, but they're getting a little further apart. So the way that he examines it is by making a list of 3 things, which I love, and Durkheim also loves, and they are the volume, the intensity, and the fixity. So let's go through them. First, the volume. The volume is about essentially how loud society's voice is in your head. How often do you hear these messages? How intensely do you hear these messages? Is your whole life sort of like informed by these messages? As sort of like little Ralph here talking about how he hates the president because the TV told him to. So for a lot of people, these messages are very loud in their lives. But that leads us to the second part, which is the intensity. And the intensity is about how intensely you believe those messages. Sure, you're being bombarded with messages about norms and social behaviors all day, but how much do you believe them? Did you have kids because people said it would be fun, or did you not have kids because you were worried about that? So the intensity is more personal, like how much do you believe the messages that are coming at you? And the final part, the fixity, is about how fixed those beliefs are in your mind, but also in society's mind. So like, is there any wiggle room? Is there sort of like room for change? Basically, he's looking at whether the voices are loud, the voices are intense, and whether the voices allow for any individualism. And what he's finding is that most people are sort of drifting away from the collective consciousness. That the voices used to be loud, intense, and fixed. But these days, a lot of people are like, no thank you. So that's the thing that he's saying is changing. We used to all have this like standard set of norms. It used to be loud, it used to be intense, it used to be fixed, and we're all sort of changing that. We're all sort of drifting away from the rules that used to hold us together. So as the collective conscience sort of dissipates, we start to see a rise in the individual. So again, this is one of the like prevailing themes of the semester, this idea that we're sort of becoming less connected to society and more connected to the individual. So this is what Durkheim has to say about that. If there are more things in common to all, there are far more that are personal to each. So essentially, yes, we have stuff in common, but increasingly we have stuff that's just for us. It is therefore at least probable that in each individual mind, the personal sphere has grown more than the other. In any case, the relation between them has at most remained the same. So probably people are becoming more and more individualistic, and if nothing else, they're at least not becoming less individualistic. But he goes on to talk about how that can be kind of great, because even though we're individual, it could be healthy for society as a whole. This is not to say, however, that the conscience collective is likely to disappear completely. Rather, it comes to consist of very general and indeterminate ways of thought and sentiment, which leaves room open for a growing variety of individual differences. So it's not that the conscience collective is disappearing entirely, it's just becoming a little looser. There's still Spider-Man, but we can all be Spider-Man now. He goes on to say that this means that we are valuing the individual more than we used to. There is even a place where it is strengthened and made precise This is in the way which it regards the individual. As all other beliefs and all the other practices take on a less and less religious character, the individual becomes the object of a sort of religion. We have a cult of personal dignity. So again, it used to be that one person didn't matter, the whole mattered. But more and more, we're starting to think about the individual as special, the individual as deserving of dignity. And so he ends this section by saying, we can then conclude by saying that all social links which result from likeness progressively slacken. So we're not as concerned with being exactly like everybody else anymore. We're not as concerned with staying at home. We're not as concerned with staying in our social groups. We're starting to see that the individual is okay. And in fact, the individual might be great, and the individual might be able to sort of rise up and appreciate the fact that they're different. I thought it would be fair to tell you a little bit about the parts you didn't read. And again, sorry about that. The pieces that we're reading come from a book that is already a compilation, so basically, the parts you didn't read were responses to other authors. So it was really common at the time, especially in academic journals, to sort of respond back and forth, almost like an open correspondence. People still do this, but not quite as much. So first, he was responding to Tönnies. I've never been good at pronouncing the German O and E at the same time, but that was close. And he had said almost the same thing, except he called it Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. So Tönnies' version was pretty similar to the organic and mechanical solidarity, and that's what Durkheim pointed out. He was also responding to another author who said that the rise of the individual was bad, and that it was inorganic and it was sort of artificial. And Durkheim said, if we're seeing this rise in the individual out of society, which is itself natural, then the rise of the individual must also be natural. So he's saying that nothing occurs in a vacuum or by random. Basically, that was natural, this is also natural, stop worrying so hard. So, we didn't read those parts because I didn't think they were so important, but I thought I'd tell you what they said anyway. Alright, so now we come to the part where he's going to start to tie things together. So this part is called The Causes of the Development of the Division of Labor. So basically, Durkheim has been talking about all of these things, and now he's going to kind of wind them together into one solid thought. He's going to bring together the division of labor, which we've talked about a lot, the rise of the individual, which has also come up a lot, and the sort of fracturing of society. So he's going to make the argument that this is all good, and it's all normal, and it's all leading us to an even better place. So he starts by saying that the division of labor has led to a division in society, but that isn't all bad. We might make some new connections. The growth of the division of labor is thus brought about by the social segments losing their individuality, as the boundaries between them become less marked. In short, a merging takes place, which makes it possible for social life to enter into new combinations. So now that we're not all hanging out with exactly the same people all of the time, we can enter into some new combinations. We can meet strangers. He says it produces a coming together between individuals who were separated, or at least a closer relationship than existed previously. Consequently, there is an interchange of action between the parts of the social mass which, until then, had no effect upon one another. So one of the things that's happening is that as we meet people we might not have previously met, we're seeing new things. We're seeing new inventions. We're learning that, in a way, we were always all the same. Like Snoop Dogg and Martha Stewart being best friends. They had a lot in common this whole time, they just didn't know each other at first. Then he says, social life, instead of being concentrated in a large number of separate small centers, each of which resembles the other, is generalized. Social relations, or more correctly, intrasocial relations, consequently become more numerous since they extend on all sides beyond their original limits. So instead of everybody in the cafeteria eating at separate tables, people are starting to sort of mix up. People are starting to expand their social boundaries. They're starting to meet people that they might not have met before. It's like the Breakfast Club. Then he says, the division of labor develops, therefore, as there are more individuals sufficiently in contact to be able to act and react upon one another. So basically, as strangers meet, they start to act and react upon one another, and that lends itself really well to the division of labor. If we agree to call this coming together, and the active commerce resulting from it, dynamic or formal density, we can say that the progress of the division of labor is in direct ratio to the moral or dynamic density of society. So this is the part that we're going to start to address. This idea that as more and more people come together, and those people are different, labor also becomes different. Because the more people that come together, the more jobs there are, yes, but also the more people that come together, the more different and weird kind of jobs we suddenly need. So what he's going to begin to address in this next section is the way that moving into the cities lended itself to the division of labor. And trust me, it will make sense. So now he's going to make us another list of 3 things, which you know I love. So basically, he's trying to explain how population density has had a larger social effect. So he talks about how physical nearness, the formation of towns, and the means of communication and transportation changed jobs. So let's go through them one by one. First, location. Whereas lower societies are spread over immense areas relative to the size of their population, among more advanced peoples, population tends to become more and more concentrated. And this is true. In nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, everybody's really spread out. But as we start to be agricultural, we start to come together, and then as we start to be industrial, we really start to come together. So for instance, in this graph, you can see how urbanization has occurred over the past 500 years, and you'll notice that we did start to live in cities more and more often, but right there at 1850, and then really right there at 1900, we started to see a huge rise in cities, thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Next, he talks about the way that towns kind of make a big difference in the way that we think about each other. Towns always result from the need of individuals to put themselves constantly in the closest possible contact with each other. The constantly increasing acceleration of this development proves that far from constituting a sort of pathological phenomenon, it comes from the very nature of higher social types. So he's saying it's not unusual, it's not pathological for us to form these towns. It's in fact super normal, especially among higher social types, which is borderline racist, because he's basically saying that they're more advanced than any other civilization, because he didn't know about all the other civilizations that already had towns. But every time we come up against this, we just have to address it and leave it. So he next argues that once we have made these towns, we start to increase the means by which we communicate and the ways that we transport ourselves. Finally, there are the number and rapidity of the means of communication and transportation. By suppressing or diminishing the gaps which separate social segments, they increase the density of society. So he's talking about pretty old-fashioned stuff, like making really good roads, or like starting to make transportation like trains or streetcars. Basically, the more transportation we have to and from cities, the more dense the cities can become. But also communication. The mail, the telegrams. Basically, the easier it is to communicate with one another, the easier it is to live in cities. So again, there are these things that are contributing to the way that we move into cities, and the fact that we move into cities begins to change other stuff. Specifically, it begins to change jobs. If work becomes progressively divided as cities become more voluminous and dense, it is not because external circumstances are more varied, but because the struggle for existence is more acute. So he's saying that it's as we move into cities and our jobs get a little bit different, it's not because of the cities themselves. Like, it's not that living in a city makes it harder. It's that there's so many more people that we don't need as many things. We don't need as many people doing the same things. So our jobs start to become more varied, and they start to become a little bit harder to get because we don't need all the same stuff over and over. So basically he's saying we have a supply and demand issue. In a town, you need one of each, but in a city, you don't need 500 of the same thing. Darwin quite correctly observed that the struggle between two organisms is as active as they are similar. So 2 birds trying to eat the same fish is a problem. 5 birds eating all different fish, not a problem. Men obey the same law. In the same city, different occupations can coexist without being obliged mutually to destroy one another. for they can pursue different objectives. The closer the functions approach one another, however, the more points of contact they have, the more consequently they are exposed to conflict. So as long as the jobs are all a little different, that's okay. But if they're really similar, that's a problem. So for instance, having a Starbucks across the street from a Starbucks, those two are going to compete. Like there's no other way around it. Probably they're both going to see less business, because why would you need two Starbucks right next to each other? Or having a mattress firm down the street from a mattress firm. Why? Nobody buys that many mattresses. It would be smarter, he says, to have different businesses next to one another. You can have a bakery and a butcher right next to each other, no problem, because they're selling two different things to two different customers, maybe even the same customer, but even so, they're not competing. So he's saying that jobs get more diverse because they have to, because we can't all have the same job in the same city. This having been said, it is easy to understand that any condensation of the social mass, especially if it is accompanied by an increase in population, necessarily stimulates an advance in the division of labor. The more people there are, the more diverse the jobs have to be. Here's his summation, which I think really helps. If society, in concentrating, determines the development of the division of labor, the latter, in its turn, increases the concentration of society. That is all we wish to prove. So again, it's kind of complicated, but it makes perfect sense. The more people there are in a town, the more businesses they need to support them. But those businesses can't all be the same thing. They have to be different. So the more people there are, the more businesses there are, the more diversity of businesses there are, the more diversity of jobs there are. And they just keep feeding one another and going in circles like that. So the bigger the city, the weirder and more specific the jobs in that city are. So division of labor is fed by population. That is all we wish to prove. So now that we have established that the division of labor is occurring, and it's especially occurring in cities, Durkheim questions whether we're doing it right. Specifically, whether we're doing it fairly. So he calls this the forced division of labor. So here is what he has to say. It is not enough for there to be rules. However, for sometimes the rules themselves are what is at fault. This is what occurs in class wars. The institution of classes, or of castes, constitutes an organization of the division of labor. So again, immediately as soon as we start to divide things, we start to rank things. And he's saying that as we enter into social divisions, social hierarchies, we also enter into hierarchies in the division of labor. So we ask certain people to do certain jobs, and he's saying maybe we're not doing that correctly. So he says, the lower classes being, or no longer being, satisfied with the role which is theirs by custom or law, aspire to functions which are closed to them, and seek to dispossess those who are exercising them. Thus, civil wars arise, which are due to the manner in which labor is distributed. So he's saying that people who are on the bottom of the social ladder are kind of looking around and being like, whoa, this isn't fair. This isn't good. Why do all of us have to be the janitors while all of you are the office workers? And he's saying this is where the class wars start. This is where the civil wars arise. That basically the part of the population that is being held down, and specifically often being held down by being asked to do only specific jobs, they're getting angry. So he says, for the division of labor to produce solidarity, it is not sufficient, then, for every individual to be given a task to perform. He has to also be suited to that task. So the division of labor is not inherently bad. It's only bad when we ask certain social classes to only do certain jobs. Because it's very much the round peg and the square hole situation. We are saying you have to do this job no matter who you are because you belong to this class. So it's not a matter of who is the best suited, it's just habit, it's just tradition, it's just the way things have always been. And his argument is that maybe that's not the best way to do things. So what Durkheim is really worried about here is the way that this is having a negative impact on society. That basically the division of labor is not inherently bad, but the way we're doing it is causing a lot of rifts. So this is what he says. The correspondence between the aptitudes of individuals and the kind of activity assigned to them is broken. in a whole large area of society. Constraint alone, more or less violent and direct in character, ties them to their functions. Hence, the solidarity which results is defective and strained. So he's saying that if we force certain segments of population into certain jobs, that's not really going to work. Because we're not concerned about their aptitude, we're not concerned about their merit, we're just making them have certain jobs based on entirely other stuff, irrelevant stuff. And he's saying that holding part of the population down is resulting in kind of fracturing society, and that it's the wrong way to pick who does what job. He has another idea. He says that we should do it what he calls spontaneously. It is quite different when the division of labor is established in virtue of purely internal spontaneity, and where nothing hampers individual initiative. For, if there is nothing which either unduly hinders or favors the chances of those competing for occupations, it is inevitable that only those who are most capable at each type of activity will move into it. So instead of having a round peg in a square hole situation, all the right shapes go in all the right holes. That if we judge who does which job based on their merit, based on their aptitude, we're going to end up with the right people in the right jobs. So instead of basing who does what job on their social class, on their race, on their gender, we should base it on their merit and on their individual ability to do the job. And he's saying if we did that, society would be much less fractured. So he goes on to say the reason we don't do this is habit. The unhappiness which results from frustrated aspirations is not enough to turn men against the social order which created them. They cling to it because their whole internal life is linked with it. All their convictions presuppose the existence of this order because, serving as the basis for the moral and religious system, it appears to them as sacred. So he's saying the reason that we just keep doing stuff this way is because it hasn't occurred to us to change it. And in fact, our traditions are kind of sacred to us. We are pretty sure that we're right about this. We have always done it this way. Why would we do it another way? So basically, Durkheim is saying, maybe this isn't correct. Maybe the fact that we have always done it this way is not a good enough reason to keep doing it this way. But he's saying the reason we don't change it is because we are so tied to the way that we have always done it. Our whole world is based on the way that we have always done it. So this last part is kind of a big old wall of text, but it's important. This is why, in organized societies, the division of labor must be increasingly placed in harmony with this idea of spontaneity that we have just defined. If such societies direct, and must direct, their energies to abolishing external inequalities as far as possible, this is not only because enterprise is intrinsically worthwhile, but because their very existence is bound up with this problem. For these societies can survive only if there is solidarity between the elements of which they are composed, and solidarity is only possible given this situation. So that is a big old wall of text, but what he's saying is that the only way for us to become a more cohesive society is to let go of the things that we used to do, the way that we used to make these decisions on who does what job, and instead to assign jobs based on ability. So hopefully this sort of helps. We are not going to do it the way that we have always done it because that's not working anymore and we have all these class wars and everybody is mad. Instead, we are going to find the right place for everybody. A place for everything and everything in its place. Or, since this is all about jobs, a job for everybody and everybody in the right job. So, Durkheim can be kind of confusing, but hopefully this made sense. Basically, he's saying, as we moved into cities, we got more and more populated, so we needed people doing more and more jobs. But they had to do more and more diverse jobs because they couldn't all do the same thing. And what we need to make sure of is that the right people are in the right diverse jobs so that we don't have class wars. We didn't believe him, we're still not doing this, but this is what we should aim for. This is what meritocracy is all about. So, that was complicated, but hopefully it made sense. I think Durkheim makes a lot of really vital points, even though he can be kind of hard to understand. So I'm looking forward to talking about it in class, and I'll see you next time. Here's my dog. He doesn't know much about Durkheim.